The autumn sun was barely peeking over the hills of Cedar Valley when Thomas adjusted his father's old denim jacket and surveyed his modest farm. 20 acres of hard-worked land stretched before him, dotted with the remnants of what was once a thriving cattle operation. The morning dew sparkled on sparse grass, where his remaining 8 cows grazed listlessly, their ribs showing through their winter coats. Thomas ran his rough hands through his graying hair, remembering better days when his father had run this place. Back then, the barns were full and the pastures teemed with life, but 3 years of drought and his wife Sarah's mounting medical bills had forced him to sell off most of their herd, piece by piece. Now, at 45, he felt twice his age, the weight of responsibility pressing down on his shoulders like the heavy clouds gathering on the horizon. His eyes drifted to the small farmhouse where Sarah was probably already awake, helping their daughter Emma with her breathing exercises. The thought of Emma's determined face during her daily struggle with cystic fibrosis made his heart ache. The doctors had recommended a new treatment, one that could significantly improve her quality of life, but the cost was well beyond what their insurance would cover. $30,000 might as well have been $3 million to a small farmer like him. The screen door creaked, and Sarah stepped onto the porch, her auburn hair catching the early morning light. Despite everything, she still carried herself with the same grace that had caught his eye at the county fair 20 years ago. She wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself and walked toward him, her steps careful on the uneven ground. "Emma's having a good morning," she said, reaching his side. "Her breathing seems easier today." Her voice carried hope, but Thomas could see the worry lines around her eyes deepening with each passing month. They both knew their daughter needed more than just good mornings. Thomas wrapped an arm around his wife's shoulders, drawing her close. "That's good news," he said softly, though his mind was already racing ahead to what the day would bring. The county livestock auction was just hours away, and with it, perhaps their only chance at turning things around. That's when Thomas had heard about Magnus, the prize Hereford ox, being auctioned off at the county seat. The animal was legendary in these parts, not just for its size and strength, but for its unique ability to work in any conditions. An ox like that could help him clear new fields, haul twice the lumber, and manage work that would normally require multiple hands. The stories about Magnus had spread through farming communities across 3 counties, how he could pull loads that would challenge a tractor, how he seemed to understand complex commands, and how his previous owner had used him to transform a failing farm into a profitable operation. Thomas had spent months preparing for this day. He'd sold his father's antique pocket watch, the last reminder of better times. He'd taken odd jobs in town, fixing fences and machinery for other farmers. He'd even sold the small plot of land where he'd planned to build Emma a garden someday. Every dollar had been carefully saved, tucked away in the worn leather pouch that now felt heavy in his jacket pocket. Sarah squeezed his hand, understanding in her eyes. "Are you sure about this, Thomas? That's everything we have." "I'm sure," he replied, his voice steady despite the nervousness churning in his stomach. "Magnus isn't just any ox. With him, I could clear that north field we've been talking about, the one with all the fallen timber. We could expand the grazing area, maybe even start that Christmas tree farm we talked about years ago." He paused, taking a deep breath. "And with the extra income, we could finally get Emma the treatment she needs." A flicker of hope crossed Sarah's face, but concern quickly followed. "The auction? There'll be big operators there, corporate farms, people with real money." Thomas nodded, well aware of what he would be walking into. The Wheeler name used to mean something in Cedar Valley, back when his grandfather had first settled this land. But now, with his threadbare jacket and mud-caked boots, he knew how he would look to the wealthy ranchers and agricultural companies that would be bidding today. "I know," he said, watching as the sun finally broke free of the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. But sometimes, Sarah, the size of a man's heart matters more than the size of his wallet. And today I'm betting everything on that being true. Emma's cough echoed from inside the house, and both parents turned instinctively toward the sound. In that moment, Thomas felt his resolve harden. He might walk into that auction house as the poorest man there, but he would walk in with his head high and his purpose clear. Because today wasn't just about buying an ox. It was about fighting for his daughter's future, for his family's legacy, and for the chance to prove that even the smallest farmer could still make a big difference in this world. The drive to the county seat gave Thomas plenty of time to think, perhaps too much. His old pickup truck rattled along the winding country roads, each mile bringing him closer to what could either be the biggest mistake or the wisest decision of his life. The leather pouch rested heavily against his chest, tucked safely in his inner jacket pocket, containing exactly $27,143, every cent he'd managed to save and scrape together. The autumn scenery flashed by his windows, golden fields ready for harvest, prosperous farms with their gleaming silos and well-maintained fences, stark reminders of what the Wheeler farm used to be. Each property he passed seemed to mock his current situation, but they also fueled his determination. He remembered his father's words, "Son, it's not about how many times you get knocked down. It's about how many times you get back up." The memory of yesterday evening's conversation with Emma flooded back as he drove. She'd been sitting up in bed, her breathing machine humming quietly beside her when he'd come to say goodnight. Despite her illness, her blue eyes still sparkled with the same curiosity and joy that had lit up their home since the day she was born. "Daddy," she'd said, her voice slightly muffled by the breathing mask, "tell me about Magnus again." It had become their nightly ritual over the past few weeks, ever since he'd first mentioned the possibility of buying the ox. Thomas had sat on the edge of her bed, careful not to disturb the medical equipment. "Well, sweetheart, Magnus isn't just any ox. They say he's the strongest animal in 3 counties. Farmer Johnson over in Millbrook says he once saw Magnus pull a fully loaded hay wagon out of mud so deep it had swallowed the wheels whole." Emma's eyes had widened. "All by himself?" "All by himself," Thomas had confirmed, smiling at her wonderment. "But you know what's really special about him. Magnus seems to know exactly what needs to be done. Almost like he can read a farmer's mind. They say he's gentle as a lamb with children, but strong as 10 horses when there's work to be done. And if you get him," Emma had said, her voice growing sleepy, "we can fix the farm. And maybe get that new medicine the doctor talked about." Thomas had felt his heart clench at her words. "That's the plan, Princess. That's the plan." Now, as he approached the outskirts of the county seat, that conversation weighed heavily on his mind. The local radio crackled with the morning farm report, announcing record profits for corporate farming operations in the region. The irony wasn't lost on Thomas. Here he was, betting everything on an ox, while the big operations were buying up small farms left and right, replacing generations of family farming knowledge with computer algorithms and GPS-guided machinery. The auction house came into view, its parking lot already filling with expensive trucks and SUVs. Thomas could see men in pressed shirts and designer boots gathering in small groups, their leather briefcases and tablets marking them as representatives of large agricultural companies. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as he pulled into one of the few remaining spots, his old truck looking particularly weathered next to a brand-new Ford F-350 with corporate logos on its doors. Before stepping out, Thomas took a moment to straighten his jacket and check that the money was secure. He pulled out a small photograph from his wallet, a family picture from last Christmas showing Emma sitting between him and Sarah, all 3 of them smiling despite the oxygen tube in Emma's nose. The photo, had become something of a talisman. For him, a reminder of exactly what he was fighting for. A group of well-dressed men passed by his truck, their conversation carrying clearly through his open window. "Did you hear about Magnus? Old man Henderson's estate is finally selling him off. Shame, really, that Ox could have made somebody a fortune in breeding fees alone. Word is, Holbrook Agribusiness is interested. They're looking to start some kind of heritage farming experience for tourists. Figured an ox like Magnus would make quite the attraction." Thomas felt his stomach twist. Holbrook Agribusiness was a corporate giant known for buying up family farms and turning them into tourist attractions or industrial operations. The thought of Magnus being reduced to a tourist attraction when he could be helping save a real family farm made something inside Thomas burn with quiet determination. He stepped out of his truck, straightening to his full height despite the curious and dismissive glances thrown his way. The autumn wind carried the smell of hay and livestock from the nearby holding pens, mixing with the expensive cologne of the corporate buyers. Somewhere in those pens was Magnus, unaware that he represented either the salvation or the final defeat of the Wheeler family farm. As Thomas walked toward the auction house entrance, he could feel the weight of every step. This wasn't just about buying an ox anymore. It was about taking a stand for something bigger. It was about proving that there was still room in this world for the small farmer, the family operation, the man who worked his land with his own two hands, rather than managing it through a computer screen. Most of all, it was about Emma. About the way her face lit up when she talked about helping on the farm once she got better. About the dreams they'd shared of rebuilding the Wheeler legacy together. About giving her a fighting chance at the life she deserved. Thomas touched the leather pouch one last time, said a quiet prayer, and walked through the auction house doors. Whatever happened next would change everything. For better or worse. There would be no going back after today. The auction house lobby hit Thomas like a wall of judgment. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting an elegant glow over the polished hardwood floors, a far cry from the mud-caked boots and weathered hands that defined his daily life. Well-dressed men and women mingled in small groups, their laughter echoing off the walls with an air of casual affluence that made Thomas's worn denim jacket feel like a brand of shame. He made his way to the registration desk, each step seeming to draw more attention than the last. The young woman behind the counter looked up at him with barely concealed surprise, her manicured fingers pausing over her keyboard. "Can I help you, sir?" Her tone carried that particular blend of politeness and uncertainty reserved for those who seemed out of place. "Yes, ma'am. Thomas Wheeler. I'm here to register for the livestock auction." He worked to keep his voice steady, fighting the urge to explain himself, to justify his presence in this temple of wealth. "Wheeler," she repeated, typing the name. Into her computer. "Oh yes, the Wheeler farm from Cedar Valley." The question carried a hint of recognition, but not the kind Thomas would have hoped for. The Wheeler name had once commanded respect in these parts, but now it was more likely associated with struggle and decline. "That's right," he replied, standing a little straighter. The leather pouch pressed against his chest like a secret armor's. She processed his registration. Thomas became acutely aware of the conversations around him, snippets floating through the air like arrows finding their mark. "Did you see the condition report on Magnus? Perfect health, incredible bloodline. Holbrook's offering is rumored to be in the 6 figures. These small operations just can't compete anymore. It's simple economics." Each word seemed to chip away at his resolve. The leather pouch suddenly felt lighter, his savings more meager. What was he thinking coming here? Standing among these titans of agriculture, with nothing but a dream and his daughter's future in his pocket. The memory of Emma's latest hospital visit flashed through his mind. The doctor's words still rang in his ears. This new treatment could change everything for her. But Mr. Wheeler, you need to understand the costs involved. The numbers had seemed impossible then, just as they did now. But watching Emma struggle for each breath, seeing Sarah's quiet tears when she thought no one was looking, those moments had hardened his resolve into something beyond mere determination. A loud laugh pulled him from his thoughts. Near the entrance, a group of men in expensive suits had gathered around Clayton Holbrook himself, the CEO of Holbrook Agribusiness. Thomas recognized him from newspaper photos. Tall, silver-haired, with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to getting his way. Their eyes met briefly across the lobby, and Thomas saw the flash of dismissal in Holbrook's expression before the businessman turned back to his associates. "Your bidding paddle, Mr. Wheeler." The registration clerk's voice brought him back to the moment. "Number 47. The auction begins in 30 minutes in the main hall." Thomas took the paddle, its weight in his hand feeling both foreign and significant. He found a quiet corner of the lobby, away from the clusters of wealthy buyers, and pulled out his phone. One new message from Sarah. "Emma's having a good day. She asked me to tell you that Magnus is waiting for you. We believe in you, honey." A small smile crossed his face as he typed back, "Tell our girl I won't let her down." But even as he sent the message, doubt gnawed at his conscience. Was he being selfish, risking their entire savings on what might be nothing more than a fool's errand? What if he lost it all? What if this one desperate gamble left them with nothing? He closed his eyes, remembering the day he'd first heard about Magnus. He'd been at the feed store, half listening to old-timers swap stories, when Magnus's name came up. The way they described him, it wasn't just about strength or work capacity. They spoke of him with a kind of reverence, as if he represented something more, something that was rapidly disappearing from their world. The belief that one good animal, paired with hard work and determination, could still change a farmer's fate. The next few weeks had been a blur of preparation. He'd approached every bank in 3 counties, but the rejections had all carried the same message. The Wheeler farm wasn't a viable investment opportunity. So he'd turned to his own resources, selling everything of value, working double shifts at the lumber yard, even selling off that small plot of land he'd saved for Emma's garden. Each sacrifice had felt like another step away from failure, another move toward giving his daughter the chance she deserved. Now, standing in this opulent lobby, those sacrifices felt simultaneously massive and insufficient. The wealthy buyers around him probably spent more on their watches than he had in his leather pouch. Their casual conversations about market consolidation and economies of scale were really discussions about the death of family farms, like is wrapped in the sterile language of business. Thomas looked down at his bidding paddle, the number 47 staring back at him like a challenge. In less than 30 minutes, he would either prove himself a fool or a visionary. The thought should have terrified him, but instead he felt a strange calm settling over him. Perhaps it was because, unlike everyone else here, he wasn't buying Magnus for profit or prestige. He was buying him for survival, not just of his farm, but of everything he held dear. The lobby began to empty as people made their way toward the main hall. Thomas stayed in his corner a moment longer, touching the leather pouch one last time. "Lord," he whispered, "I'm not asking for a miracle, just a fair chance to fight for my family." With that prayer on his lips, he straightened his shoulders and walked toward the auction hall, ready to face whatever came next. Win or lose, he would face it on his feet, with his head held high, just as his father had taught him, just as he hoped to teach Emma someday. The main auction hall was a cavernous space that seemed designed to make small farmers feel even smaller. Rows of cushioned seats stretched toward a raised platform where a mahogany podium stood, gleaming under spotlight beams. The air was thick with the scent of leather, coffee, and expensive cologne, a far cry from the honest sweat and soil that perfumed Thomas's daily life. Thomas chose a seat near the back, partly to avoid drawing attention and partly to observe the room. His weathered boots rested on plush carpeting that probably cost more than his last harvest. Around him, the seats filled quickly with an array of buyers that told its own story about the changing face of American agriculture. Corporate representatives in tailored suits tapped away on tablets, investment bankers whispered into Bluetooth devices, and a handful of other traditional farmers, looking as out of place as he felt, sat scattered throughout the room. Clayton. Holbrook and his entourage made a grand entrance, claiming a row of prime seats near the front. Their conversation carried clearly through the hall. Magnus would be perfect for our heritage farm experience. Imagine the photos. Children posing with a genuine working ox. It's marketing gold. The words made Thomas's stomach turn. He'd heard about these heritage farm experiences, carefully sanitized versions of farm life designed for tourists, where real agricultural work was reduced to photo opportunities and petting zoos. The thought of Magnus, with all his power and potential, being reduced to a tourist attraction was almost unbearable. A movement at the hall's entrance caught his attention. Two handlers were leading Magnus past the large viewing windows, giving potential buyers a last look before the bidding began. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. The stories hadn't done the ox justice. Magnus was magnificent, a Hereford ox of incredible proportions, his red-brown coat gleaming with health, his movements powerful yet graceful. But it was his eyes that struck Thomas the most, intelligent, calm, somehow both gentle and fierce at the same time. "Quite a specimen, isn't he?" The voice came from beside him, making Thomas start. An elderly man had taken the seat next to him, his face weathered by years of sun and wind. "Frank Miller," he introduced himself with a nod, "used to work with Henderson, Magnus's previous owner." "Thomas Wheeler," Thomas replied, grateful for a friendly face in the crowd. "Did you work with Magnus?" Frank's eyes crinkled with memory. "Every day for 5 years. That ox isn't just strong, he's smart. Knows what needs doing before you tell him. Gentle, too, despite his size. Henderson's grandkids used to ride on his back." He paused, his expression growing serious. "Shame, what's likely to happen today? Henderson always said Magnus belonged on a working farm, not some corporate showcase." Before Thomas could respond, the auctioneer approached the podium, his voice booming through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's special livestock auction. Our premier lot today needs little introduction." As the auctioneer launched into his opening speech, Thomas felt the leather pouch against his chest like a talisman. He thought of Emma, probably sitting on their front porch right now, waiting for news. He thought of Sarah, trying to keep busy to hide her worry. He thought of his father, who had taught him that a farmer's worth wasn't measured by the size of his operation, but by the strength of his character. The room hushed as Magnus was led into the display area adjacent to the auction floor. Under the bright lights, he looked even more impressive. The ox moved with a quiet dignity, as if aware of his own worth, but unbothered by the attention. His calm demeanor seemed at odds with the frenzied energy building in the room. "The bidding will start at $50,000, the auctioneer announced, and Thomas's heart sank. It was higher than he'd expected, though still within his reach, barely. But he knew the real challenge wouldn't be the starting price. It would be the corporate buyers who could raise the bid far beyond his means. Around him, the atmosphere shifted as buyers prepared their strategies. Tablets were positioned, phones were readied, and Thomas could see Holbrook's team organizing what looked like detailed bidding plans. He felt suddenly acutely aware of how unprepared he must appear. Just a farmer with a leather pouch and a dream that was starting to feel more impossible by the second. Frank Miller leaned over, speaking softly. "Word of advice? Magnus doesn't like people who see him as a thing to be owned. He knows the difference between someone who needs him and someone who wants to use him." Henderson always said that ox could read a person's heart. Thomas nodded, grateful for the encouragement, but unsure how it would help him in the face of cold, hard cash. The auctioneer's voice cut through his thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen, shall we begin? $50,000 for this exceptional Hereford ox. Who'll give me 50,000? Several paddles rose immediately. Thomas kept his down, remembering his father's advice about auctions. Let the eager ones tire themselves out early. He watched as the price quickly climbed. 55,000, 60,000, 65,000. Each increment felt like another door closing, another step away from his dream. But as he watched Magnus standing calmly in the display area, something stirred in his heart. The ox's quiet strength, his patient dignity in the face of all this human commotion, reminded Thomas of everything he was fighting for. This wasn't just about buying an animal. It was about believing that sometimes, just sometimes, determination and genuine need could triumph over mere money. The price hit 70,000, and Thomas felt the weight of his leather pouch, knowing that soon, very soon, he would have to enter this fight. He touched the family photo in his pocket one last time, drew a deep breath, and prepared himself for what was to come. Win or lose, he would show these corporate buyers that a wheeler never backed down from a challenge, no matter how impossible. The odds might seem 75,000, called the auctioneer, his practiced eye scanning the room. Do I hear 80? A paddle rose smoothly near the front, one of Holbrook's team. 80,000 from number 23. Thomas watched as the bidding continued its upward climb, each increment feeling like another nail in his dream's coffin. His hand gripped the paddle numbered 47, not yet raised, while his other hand pressed against the leather pouch containing his life savings. The room had taken on a surreal quality, the bright lights and polished wood seeming to blur at the edges of his vision. 85,000 to number 31. A corporate buyer from Midwest Agriculture Limited smirked as he raised his paddle. The man's Italian suit probably cost more than Thomas's monthly farm income. It was then that Thomas felt the first stirrings of whispers around him. His presence hadn't gone unnoticed, and now that the bidding was well underway, the wealthy buyers had begun to cast curious glances in his direction. He could hear their murmured conversations, not quite quiet enough to be private. "Isn't that old John Wheeler's son? The one whose farm is barely hanging on? What's he doing here? Surely he can't think." A particularly loud whisper cut through the air. Probably just wanted to see what a real auction looks like. Laughter rippled through a nearby group of corporate representatives. Clayton Holbrook himself turned in his seat, casting an appraising look at Thomas. The businessman's expression was a mixture of amusement and condescension that made Thomas's face burn. But he kept his eyes forward, focused on Magnus in the display area. The ox's calm presence seemed to radiate strength, helping Thomas maintain his composure despite the growing tension in the room. $90,000. The auctioneer's voice boomed through the speakers. "Do I hear 95? Thomas felt Frank Miller shift beside him. "Don't let them rattle you, son," the old man whispered. "I've seen that look before, the one Magnus has right now. He's watching everything, understanding more than these folks realize. Indeed, the ox is intelligent. I seem to be taking in the scene, moving from bidder to bidder with an almost human sense of assessment." When his gaze met Thomas's, there was a moment of connection that made Thomas's heart skip a beat. In that brief instant, he felt understood in a way that transcended the artificial atmosphere of the auction house. $100,000. The auctioneer's excitement was palpable. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached 6 figures for this exceptional animal." The announcement caused a stir in the room. Several smaller buyers lowered their paddles, accepting defeat. The field was narrowing to the serious contenders, mostly corporate representatives now, their faces set with determination. Holbrook's team huddled briefly, obviously discussing strategy. Thomas felt the weight of his savings pressing against his chest. $27,843. The number that had seemed so substantial on his small farm now felt pitiful in this grand auction house. Yet he stayed seated, his paddle still unraised, remembering his father's words about patience in an auction. A new voice cut through his thoughts, loud enough to be deliberately overheard. "I heard he mortgaged everything he had left just to be here." The speaker was one of Holbrook's associates, a young man in an expensive suit who didn't bother to hide his smirk. Probably thinks he can miracle his way into buying Magnus. These small farmers never know when to quit. The words stung, but they also awakened something in Thomas. He thought of Emma at home, probably sitting by the window watching for his return. He thought of Sarah, who had supported his decision despite her own doubts. He thought of his father, who had taught him that dignity wasn't about what you owned, but how you conducted yourself in the face of adversity. 110,000? The auctioneer's voice rose with excitement. "Do I hear 115? The room had transformed into a battlefield, though the weapons were paddles and bank accounts rather than swords and shields. Thomas watched as Magnus shifted in the display area, the ox's powerful muscles rippling under his glossy coat. There was something almost prophetic about the animal's calm demeanor amid all this human greed and ambition. Clayton Holbrook raised his paddle with a flourish. 120,000, he called out, his voice carrying a note of triumph. He turned slightly, making sure Thomas could see his satisfied smile. The auctioneer barely contained his glee. 120,000, a magnificent bid for a magnificent animal. Do I hear 125? Thomas felt the moment approaching, the moment when he would have to decide. His hand tightened on his paddle, and he could feel Frank Miller's supportive presence beside him. The leather pouch seemed to burn against his chest, each dollar inside representing a sacrifice, a dream, a hope for his family's future. The whispers around him had grown louder, more pointed. Why is he even still here? Someone should tell him to leave before he embarrasses himself. These small operations need to learn when they're beaten. But Thomas remained seated, his back straight, his eyes fixed on Magnus. The ox had turned his head, seeming to look directly at him, and in those deep, knowing eyes, Thomas saw something that gave him strength. It wasn't just about buying an ox anymore. It was about standing up for something bigger than himself, about proving that sometimes the size of one's heart mattered more than the size of one's wallet. The auctioneer's voice cut through the air again. $120,000. Going once. Thomas took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. Everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed, had led to this point. With trembling fingers, he touched the family photo in his pocket one last time. Drew strength from the smiling faces of Emma and Sarah, and prepared himself for what would come next. $120,000. Going twice. The auctioneer's voice hung in the air like suspended thunder. Thomas could feel every eye in the room turned toward him as he slowly, deliberately raised paddle number 47, 125,000. His voice carried clearly through the sudden silence. The amount was far beyond what he possessed, but something deep inside told him to trust, to have faith. The collective gasp that followed his bid was almost theatrical in its intensity. Clayton Holbrook spun in his seat, his composed facade cracking for the first time. The gentleman in the back bids 125,000. The auctioneer could barely contain his excitement at this unexpected turn of events. Do I hear 130? Holbrook recovered quickly, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. 140,000, he called out, his voice dripping. With confidence, he turned again, fixing Thomas with a look that clearly said, "Know your place." Thomas felt his heart hammering against the leather pouch. He was already bidding money he didn't have, but something kept his hand steady as he raised his paddle again. 145,000. The whispers had turned to open murmurs now. Corporate representatives were hurriedly consulting their phones, probably looking up information about the Wheeler farm, trying to make sense of this unexpected challenge. Frank Miller sat silently beside him, a small smile playing at the corners of his weathered mouth. 160,000, Holbrook announced, his voice carrying an edge of irritation. He stood up, making sure everyone could see him clearly. "Let's end this little charade, shall we?" Thomas felt a bead of sweat roll down his back. The number was astronomical, far beyond anything he could hope to manage. But then he caught Magnus's eye again, and in that moment something passed between them, an understanding, a connection that transcended mere commerce. 165,000, Thomas called out, his voice stronger than he felt. The room erupted in a mixture of gasps and laughter. Someone behind him muttered, "He's lost his mind." Another voice added, "This is becoming embarrassing." Holbrook's face had turned an interesting shade of red. 200,000, he snapped, turning fully to face Thomas. "And I can go much higher, Mr. Wheeler. Don't force me to embarrass you further." The auctioneer was practically dancing with joy at the unexpected drama. $200,000 from Mr. Holbrook. "Do I hear any advance on 200,000? Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, thinking of Emma. He could almost hear her voice. "Daddy, Magnus is waiting for you." His hand trembled as he raised the paddle one more time. 205,000. The laughter had died now, replaced by an uncomfortable tension. Even those who had been mocking him seemed unsettled by his persistence. Magnus stood perfectly still in the display area, his eyes never leaving Thomas. Holbrook's voice cut through, the silence like a whip. "This is ridiculous. $250,000, and let that be the end of it." He turned to Thomas, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "Unless you'd care to explain to everyone here exactly how a failing farmer plans to pay for these absurd bids." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Thomas felt the weight of every stare, heard the rustle of people shifting in their seats, waiting for his response. His fingers found the family photo in his pocket, touching it like a talisman. Slowly, deliberately, he stood up. The leather pouch pressed against his chest as he took a deep breath. "Mr. Holbrook," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "you're right. I don't have $250,000. I don't even have half that." Half that. A wave of murmurs swept through the room. Holbrook's triumphant smile began to spread. "What I do have," Thomas continued, "is everything I own in this world. Every penny I've saved, every asset I've sold, every drop of sweat I've poured into. My land. I have a daughter at home who needs medical treatment I can't afford, and a farm that's been in my family for 3 generations, struggling to survive." The room had gone completely silent. Even the auctioneer seemed frozen, his gavel suspended in mid-air. "You see Magnus as an attraction, Mr. Holbrook, a marketing tool, but I see him as hope. Hope for my family, for my farm, for everything I've spent my life believing in. So no, I can't match your money, but I can promise you this: every bid I've made today represents not just dollars, but dreams. Dreams of a father who would do anything to save his daughter, of a farmer who still believes in the dignity of working the land with his own hands." Thomas's voice grew stronger with each word. "So yes, I'll bid 255,000 dollars. Money I don't have, may never have. But I make that bid, standing on my feet, looking you in the eye, offering everything I am and everything I hope to be. Because sometimes, Mr. Holbrook, the true value of something isn't in its price tag, but in what it means to the heart that seeks it. The silence that followed was absolute. Magnus had turned fully toward Thomas now, his massive head held high, as if bearing witness to something profound. Frank Miller's eyes glistened with unshed tears. The auctioneer cleared his throat. $255,000 from number 47. Do I hear any advance on $255,000? All eyes turned to Clayton Holbrook. The businessman stood frozen, his face unreadable, caught in a moment that had somehow transformed from a simple auction into something far more significant. The fate of the Wheeler farm, of Emma's treatment, of Magnus himself, all hung in the balance of the next few seconds. The silence in the auction house stretched like a rubber band, pulled to its breaking point. Clayton Holbrook remained standing, his expression cycling through a range of emotions, anger, confusion, and something else, something that looked almost like shame. The auctioneer's voice cut through the tension. $255,000. Going once? Thomas stood his ground, heart pounding against the leather pouch that contained everything he owned in the world, not even a tenth of his final bid. His eyes never left Holbrook's face, even as his mind raced with the magnitude of what he'd just done. What would happen when they discovered he couldn't pay? Would they press charges? Would this desperate gamble cost him everything? Going twice. The whispers had died completely now. Even those who had been mocking him earlier sat in stunned silence. Magnus stood in the display area, his massive presence somehow both calming and majestic, those intelligent eyes still fixed on Thomas. Just before the auctioneer could say sold, Clayton Holbrook raised his hand. Thomas's heart sank. But instead of making another bid, the businessman did something unexpected. He spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. Before you bring that gavel down, Holbrook said, I'd like to ask Mr. Wheeler something. He turned to face Thomas fully. You said your daughter needs medical treatment. What kind? Thomas swallowed hard, but his voice remained steady. Cystic fibrosis. There's a new treatment that could help her, but our insurance won't cover. Holbrook nodded slowly, then did something that made the entire room gasp. He sat down, deliberately folding his hands in his lap. I withdraw my last bid, he announced. The ox belongs to Mr. Wheeler, if he still wants him at $255,000. The auctioneer blinked in confusion. Sir, are you sure? Absolutely. Holbrook's voice carried a note of finality. Though I would like to speak with Mr. Wheeler privately after the auction concludes. The gavel fell with a crack that seemed to echo through Thomas's very bones. Sold to paddle number 47 for $255,000. The room erupted in chaos. People were standing, talking, pointing. Thomas felt his legs go weak, and he grabbed the back of his chair for support. Frank Miller's weathered hand gripped his shoulder. Steady, son, the old man murmured. Something's happening here, something bigger than all of us. Before Thomas could respond, he was surrounded by auction officials, their faces serious. Mr. Wheeler, if you'll come with us to complete the paperwork. His mouth went dry. This was it, the moment when everything would fall apart. He followed them to a small office off the main auction floor, his steps feeling leaden. But before they could begin reviewing the payment terms, Clayton Holbrook strode in, closing the door behind him. Gentlemen, he said to the officials, would you give us the room for a moment? Once they were alone, Holbrook studied Thomas for a long moment. You know, he said finally, I knew your father. John Wheeler was one of the most honest men I ever met. Turned down several offers from my company to buy his land, always saying some things were worth more than money. Thomas nodded, unsure where this was going. I've spent the last 20 years turning farms into tourist attractions, Holbrook continued, making more money than I could ever spend. But standing there today, listening to you, I remembered something I'd forgotten, something about what farming used to mean. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a checkbook. "I'm going to make you a deal, Mr. Wheeler. I'll cover the difference between your bid and what you actually have in that pouch. No loans, no interest, no strings attached." Thomas stared at him in disbelief. "Why would you do that?" "Because sometimes we need reminding of what really matters in this world." Holbrook's voice grew softer. "My own daughter. She died of cystic fibrosis 15 years ago. We had all the money in the world, but back then there weren't any treatments that could help her." He wrote out the check with steady hands. "Consider this an investment in hope, Mr. Wheeler, in memory of my Laura and in honor of your Emma." He held out the check. "Magnus belongs with someone who sees him as more than just a business asset. Use him well. Build something real. And when your daughter gets better, because she will get better, teach her what you taught everyone in that auction room today, that the size of a person's heart matters more than the size of their wallet." Thomas took the check with trembling hands, tears blurring his vision. Outside the office window, he could see Magnus being led to the loading area, the ox's powerful presence seeming to radiate certainty and purpose. "Thank you," Thomas managed to say. "I don't know how to—" "Don't thank me," Holbrook interrupted, extending his hand. "Just promise me one thing. When times get hard, and they will get hard, remember today. Remember that sometimes the greatest victory isn't in winning, but in having the courage to stand up for what you believe in, no matter the odds." They shook hands, and in that moment, Thomas felt the weight of the impossible day settling into something real and solid. He had come to the auction hoping to buy an ox, but he was leaving with something far more precious: hope, dignity, and a chance to prove that some dreams were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. As he walked back into the main hall, Frank Miller was waiting for him, a knowing smile on his weathered face. "Henderson always said Magnus had a way of bringing out the best in people," the old man said softly. "Looks like he was right again." Thomas nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Through the windows, he could see the afternoon sun painting the sky in shades of gold and promise. It was time to go home, to tell Emma and Sarah that sometimes miracles came in unexpected packages, and that tomorrow would bring a new chapter in the Wheeler family story. The early morning mist curled around Magnus's powerful legs as he and Thomas worked together in the north field. 3 months had passed since the auction, and each day had brought new revelations about what was possible when man and beast worked in true partnership. The once impossible task of clearing the fallen timber from last year's storm was nearly complete. What might have taken Thomas months alone, or cost thousands in equipment rental, Magnus accomplished with seemingly effortless strength. But it wasn't just the ox's physical power that amazed Thomas. It was his intelligence, his almost uncanny ability to anticipate what needed to be done. "Easy now," Thomas called softly as Magnus maneuvered another massive log toward the growing pile. The ox responded to his voice with a gentle flick of his ears, adjusting his angle slightly to avoid a hidden stump. Frank Miller's words from the auction day echoed in Thomas's mind. "That ox knows what needs doing before you tell him." The transformation of the Wheeler farm was becoming the talk of Cedar Valley. Where once there had been struggling pastures and declining infrastructure, new life was taking root. The cleared north field would soon be ready for planting Christmas trees, a long-term investment that could secure Emma's future. The existing pastures, benefiting from Magnus's help with irrigation improvements, were showing signs of recovery. But the most significant change had nothing to do with the land itself. Emma's new treatments, made possible by Clayton Holbrook's unexpected generosity, were showing promising results. Her breathing had improved, her energy levels were rising, and for the first time in years, she was able to spend time outside, helping with small tasks around the farm. Thomas watched as his daughter approached Magnus with a brush in hand. The massive ox lowered his head gently, allowing her to reach his neck. The sight still brought a lump to Thomas's throat. This creature of immense power, being so careful, so tender with his little girl. "Daddy!" Emma called out, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "Magnus says we should take a break," Thomas laughed. "Oh, he told you that, did he?" "Mm-hmm. He says you've been working since sunrise, and it's time for breakfast." She patted the ox's broad neck. "Isn't that right, Magnus?" The ox made a soft sound that could almost be taken for agreement, causing Emma to giggle. The sound of her laughter, once rare due to her constant breathing struggles, now rang out regularly. Across the farm, Sarah appeared on the porch waving to them. "She's right, you know. Come on in, both of you. I've got fresh biscuits and the coffee's hot." As they walked back to the house, Thomas marveled at the changes 3 months had brought. The money saved by Magnus's help with clearing land and improving infrastructure had allowed them to hire 2 part-time workers from town. The Wheeler farm was providing employment again, just as it had in his father's day. Word had spread about Magnus, drawing visitors from neighboring counties. But, unlike the tourist attraction Holbrook had envisioned, these were farmers seeking advice and inspiration. Thomas never turned them away, remembering his own desperate hope from that day at the auction. "Your father would be proud," Sarah said softly as they sat down to breakfast. She squeezed his hand across the table, her eyes bright with unshed tears, not just of the farm, but of you. The way you stood up that day at the auction, people still talk about it. Emma, her color better than it had been in years, chimed in. "Jimmy Parker at school said his dad calls you the farmer who fought a giant, like David and Goliath." Thomas felt his face warm at the words. The story of the auction had taken on almost mythical proportions in Cedar Valley. Some details had grown in the telling, the amount of the final bid, the drama of the confrontation with Holbrook, but the essential truth remained. Sometimes courage meant standing up for what you believed in, even when the odds seemed impossible. After breakfast, Thomas returned to the north field, Magnus following with patient dignity. The ox's presence had become more than just practical help. He was a symbol of hope, a reminder that sometimes the greatest blessings came disguised as challenges. A truck pulled up at the fence line. Another visitor, this time a young farmer from 3 counties over. Thomas recognized the look in the man's eyes, the same desperate hope he'd carried into the auction house that day. "Mr. Wheeler?" The young man's voice cracked slightly. I heard about what you did, about Magnus, about how you're making it work as a small farmer. I was wondering if you might have some time to talk." Thomas glanced at Magnus, who had paused in his work to observe the newcomer. The ox's intelligent eyes seemed to say, "This is part of our purpose too." "Come on over," Thomas called, waving the young man toward the gate. "Magnus and I were just about to take a break anyway." He smiled, remembering Emma's words from earlier. "Let me tell you a story about how sometimes the biggest changes start with having the courage to believe in something bigger than yourself." The morning sun climbed higher, painting the recovering land in shades of promise. In the distance, Emma's laughter rang out again, a sound as precious as any musical note. Magnus stood quietly, his presence a testament to the truth Thomas had learned that day at the auction, that some things in this world couldn't be measured in dollars and cents, that sometimes the greatest wealth lay in having the courage to stand up for what you believed in. No matter the odds, the Wheeler farm was more than just land now. It was becoming a beacon of hope for other small farmers, a living proof that with faith, determination, and perhaps a bit of divine intervention, even the most impossible dreams could take root and grow. 6 months to the day after the auction, Thomas received an envelope that would change everything again. The return address showed the seal of the State Agricultural Association, and inside was an invitation that made his hands tremble. "Keynote speaker, Annual Farmers Conference, the future of family farming in America." He found Sarah in Emma's room, where they were going through her latest breathing test results, all showing remarkable improvement. The doctors were using words like unprecedented and miraculous to describe her response to the treatment. "They want me to speak," he said, still staring at the invitation, "at the state conference, the same one Dad used to attend." Sarah took the letter, her eyes widening as she read. "Thomas, this is the biggest agricultural event in the state. All the major players attend." "I know." He sat on the edge of Emma's bed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Clayton Holbrook's name is listed as the introduction speaker. The past 6 months had brought changes none of them could have imagined. The Wheeler farm had become something of a phenomenon in agricultural circles. What started as curious visitors had grown into a steady stream of farmers, agricultural students, and even corporate representatives, all coming to see how a small family farm was not just surviving, but thriving in an age of corporate agriculture. Magnus had become legendary in his own right. Stories spread about his intelligence, his gentle nature with children, his incredible strength. But more than that, he had become a symbol of something larger, the potential for traditional farming methods to work alongside modern innovations. "You have to do it, Daddy," Emma said, her voice strong and clear, a sound that still brought joy to Thomas's heart. "Tell them about Magnus, about believing in miracles." The conference was scheduled for the following month, giving Thomas time to prepare. But how could he put into words everything that had happened? How could he explain the transformation that had taken place, not just on his land, but in his heart? The day of the conference arrived sooner than he expected. Thomas stood backstage in the massive convention center, adjusting the tie Sarah had insisted he wear. Through the curtain, he could hear the murmur of hundreds of voices: corporate executives, agricultural scientists, family farmers, all gathered to discuss the future of farming in America. Clayton Holbrook found him there, looking more relaxed than he had at the auction. "Ready, Thomas?" "Honestly, no." Thomas managed a small smile. "Give me a field to plow or a fence to mend any day." Holbrook laughed. "You know what they're calling your farm now? The Wheeler Miracle? Your story has gone beyond just farming. It's about hope, about proving that the little guy can still make it in this world." Before Thomas could respond, the convention chairman was calling them to the stage. Holbrook squeezed his shoulder and walked out to begin the introduction. "Ladies and gentlemen," Holbrook's voice carried clearly through the packed auditorium, "6 months ago, I thought I knew everything about modern agriculture. I thought success could be measured in profit margins and market share. Then I met a farmer who taught me that sometimes the true measure of success lies not in what we gain, but in what we're willing to stand for." Thomas listened as Holbrook recounted the auction day, though the businessman's perspective brought new depths to the story. He described not just the drama of the bidding, but the moment of recognition, of seeing in Thomas's stand something that had been lost in the rush toward bigger, more efficient, more profitable farming. "So it is my honor to introduce to you Thomas Wheeler, a man who reminded an entire industry that farming isn't just a business. It's a calling, a way of life, and sometimes a testament to the power of believing in something bigger than ourselves." The applause that greeted Thomas as he walked onto the stage was thunderous. Looking out over the sea of faces, he recognized many of them: farmers who had visited his land, corporate representatives who had come to study his methods, young agricultural students who had sought his advice. As the applause died down, Thomas took a deep breath and began to speak. He told them about Magnus, about Emma's recovery, about the transformation of his land. But more than that, he told them about faith. Faith in traditional farming methods, faith in the power of partnership between man and animal, faith in the future of family farming. "We stand at a crossroads," he said. his voice growing stronger with each word. "We can choose to see farming solely as a business, measuring success in dollars and cents. Or we can remember what drew our ancestors to this life in the first place. The connection to the land, the satisfaction of honest work, the joy of seeing things grow." He spoke about the visitors to his farm, about the hope he saw in their eyes. They come looking for a miracle, but what they find is something simpler, proof that with faith, hard work, and perhaps a bit of divine intervention, even the smallest farm can thrive in today's world. As he spoke, Thomas could see heads nodding, could feel the energy in the room shifting. Even the corporate executives were leaning forward, caught up in his vision of a future where family farms and modern agriculture could coexist and complement each other. "The Wheeler farm isn't a miracle," he concluded. "It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in the size of our operation, but in the size of our dreams. That sometimes the most powerful force in the world is the courage to stand up for what we believe in, even when everyone else says it's impossible." The standing ovation that followed lasted for nearly 5 minutes. But for Thomas, the most meaningful response came later when a young farmer approached him with tears in his eyes. "Mr. Wheeler," he said, "you've given us hope again. Hope that there's still a place for people like us in this changing world." The morning after the conference, Thomas found an unexpected visitor waiting at his farm gate. Clayton Holbrook stood there, looking different from his usual corporate self in casual clothes and work boots. Behind him, a sleek corporate SUV seemed out of place against the rural backdrop. "Hope you don't mind the early visit," Holbrook said, extending his hand. "After your speech yesterday, I couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about something my father used to say about the land, how it has a way of teaching us what really matters." Thomas opened the gate, noticing how Holbrook's eyes moved appreciatively over the improvements to the farm. The once struggling property now showed signs of careful restoration: new fencing, rehabilitated pastures, and the newly cleared north field where young Christmas tree saplings were taking root. Magnus was working in the nearest field, his powerful presence drawing Holbrook's immediate attention. The ox paused in his labor, turning to study the visitor with those intelligent eyes that seemed to see straight to a person's soul. "He's even more impressive now than at the auction," Holbrook admitted, watching as Magnus effortlessly maneuvered a heavy irrigation pipe into position. "But it's more than just his strength, isn't it? There's something about the way he works with you, like he understands exactly what needs to be done." "That's because he does," Thomas replied, leading the way toward the field. "Frank Miller, you remember him from the auction? He told me Magnus has a way of knowing what's in a person's heart. Took me a while to understand what he meant by that. As they walked, Holbrook seemed to be gathering his thoughts. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since the auction," he finally said, "about what we've lost in our rush to modernize everything, about what farming used to mean." They reached the field where Magnus worked, and the ox approached them with unhurried dignity. To Thomas's surprise, Holbrook reached out slowly, allowing Magnus to smell his hand before gently touching the ox's broad forehead. "You know," Holbrook continued, his voice softer now, "when I first came to that auction, I saw Magnus as nothing more than a marketing opportunity, a living attraction for our Heritage Farm Experience project. But watching you bid that day, hearing you speak about what he meant to your family, to your daughter," he paused, emotion thick in his voice. "It made me remember why my father started farming in the first place." Emma's voice carried across the field as she came running from the house, her breathing strong and steady in a way that still amazed Thomas every day. "Dad, Mum says breakfast is—" "Oh!" She stopped short at the sight of their visitor, but her face broke into a warm smile. "Mr. Holbrook, did you come to see Magnus?" Holbrook's face softened as he looked at Emma, healthy color in her cheeks and vigor in her step. "Actually, I came to see your father, to tell him something important." He turned back to Thomas. I'm shutting down the Heritage Farm Experience Project. Thomas blinked in surprise. But I thought that was your company's big initiative for the... Yeah, it was, Holbrook nodded. But after your speech yesterday, I realized we were going about it all wrong. We were trying to create an artificial version of farm life when real farms, families like yours, are fighting to survive and adapt. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. Instead, I want to propose something different, a partnership program. Holbrook Agribusiness working with family farms to preserve traditional farming methods while incorporating sustainable modern practices. Not buying them out, but supporting them, helping them thrive on their own terms. Thomas took the folder, aware that this moment represented something significant, not just for his farm, but for all the small farmers who had nearly lost hope. We'd like the Wheeler Farm to be our first partner, Holbrook continued, not to change what you're doing, but to help document it, to show other farmers that there's a middle path between complete modernization and being left behind. Magnus would stay here, of course. He's as much a part of this place as the land itself now. Emma had moved closer to Magnus, her small hand resting on his powerful shoulder. The ox stood perfectly still, as he always did when she was near, his gentle nature belying his enormous strength. What do you think, Magnus? She asked softly. Should we help other farms learn what you taught us? The ox made a soft sound, causing both Emma and Holbrook to laugh. The corporate executive's face showed a vulnerability Thomas had never seen before. You know, Holbrook said, watching Emma with Magnus, when my Laura was sick, I threw myself into making money, thinking if I just had enough resources, I could somehow fix everything. It took watching your family, seeing how you faced your challenges with faith and dignity, to understand what I'd lost along the way. Thomas looked out over his land, the fields Magnus had helped clear, the pastures showing new growth, the small signs of prosperity returning to the Wheeler Farm. He thought of all the farmers who had visited, seeking hope and advice, and all those who still struggled to keep their family legacy alive. A partnership, he said slowly, testing the word. Not a takeover? Your farm, your rules, Holbrook. Confirmed. We provide support, resources, and documentation. You show the world that traditional farming isn't just about preserving the past. It's about building a sustainable future. As if to seal the agreement, Magnus lowered his massive head, gently butting against Holbrook's shoulder. The gesture, coming from such a powerful animal, seemed to carry its own kind of blessing. Well, Thomas smiled, extending his hand to Holbrook, I guess Magnus has made his opinion known. Welcome to the Wheeler way of farming, Sarah called from the porch, announcing breakfast was ready. As they walked back to the house, Thomas couldn't help but marvel at the changes 6 months had brought. The auction that could have marked the end of his dreams had instead become a beginning, not just for his family, but for a new way of thinking about the future of farming itself. Behind them, Magnus returned to his work, his steady presence, a reminder that sometimes the greatest transformations came not from fighting against change, but from finding ways to bridge the old and the new, keeping faith with the timeless values that had always been at the heart of working the land. 1 year to the day after the famous auction, the Wheeler Farm hosted a gathering that would have seemed impossible 12 months ago. Farmers from across the state, agricultural students, corporate representatives, and local families all gathered in the North Field, now transformed into a thriving Christmas tree plantation with neat rows of growing saplings stretching toward the horizon. Magnus stood at the center of it all, his magnificent presence drawing constant attention. Children approached him fearlessly, drawn by his gentle nature, while their parents marveled at the stories of his strength and intelligence. Emma, now strong enough to run and play like any other child her age, had appointed herself his official ambassador, proudly telling visitors about his latest accomplishments. "He helped clear this whole field," she explained to a group of fascinated agricultural students. "Daddy says he's smarter than any machine because he knows exactly how to help without being told." Thomas watched from the edge of the gathering, his heart full. The past year had brought changes he could never have imagined. The partnership with Holbrook Agribusiness had evolved into something revolutionary, a new model for preserving family farms while embracing sustainable innovation. Already, dozens of other farms had joined the program, each finding their own way to blend tradition with progress. Sarah appeared at his side, slipping her hand into his. "Penny for your thoughts, farmer?" "Just thinking about that day at the auction," he replied, squeezing her hand. "How close we came to losing everything. How one moment of courage changed our whole world." Clayton Holbrook approached them, looking relaxed in casual clothes that would have seemed alien on him a year ago. "The news crews are here," he said. "They want to interview you about the program's success, but I told them they'd have to wait until after your speech." Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of the words he'd prepared for this occasion. The gathered crowd began to quiet as he made his way to the small platform they'd set up beneath an old oak tree. Magnus, as if sensing the importance of the moment, moved to stand nearby, his steady presence lending strength as it had so many times before. "A year ago," Thomas began, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed gathering, "I stood in an auction house with nothing but hope in my heart and faith in my prayers. I was trying to save my farm, save my daughter, save everything I believed in. What I didn't realize was that I was part of something much bigger than myself." He gestured to the transformed land around them. "This isn't just a story about one farm, one family, or one remarkable ox. It's a story about remembering what matters most in life, about having the courage to stand up for what you believe in, even when the odds seem impossible." Thomas saw tears in many eyes as he continued, "We live in a world of rapid change, where it's easy to forget the wisdom of the past in our rush toward the future. But there's a middle path, one that honors tradition while embracing progress, that values both the power of technology and the strength of a human heart." Emma had made her way to Magnus's side, her small hand resting on his broad shoulder. The sight of them together, his daughter healthy and strong, the magnificent ox that had helped make it possible, brought a lump to Thomas's throat. The miracle of the Wheeler farm isn't in its success, but in its message, that faith, courage, and determination still matter in this world. That sometimes the greatest strength lies not in the size of our operation, but in the size of our dreams. That no matter how far we advance, some things remain timeless. The value of hard work, the importance of family, the power of believing in something bigger than ourselves. He looked out over the crowd, seeing hope reflected in their faces. "A year ago, I bid money I didn't have because I believed in something I couldn't prove. Today, I stand before you as living proof that sometimes the greatest victories come not from having the most resources, but from having the courage to fight for what matters most." As his words faded, Magnus lifted his head and let out a deep, resonant sound that seemed to echo the truth of everything Thomas had said. The crowd burst into applause, many wiping tears from their eyes. Later, as the sun began to set and the gathering slowly dispersed, Thomas stood with his family, watching Magnus graze peacefully in the evening light. The ox had become more than just an animal. He was a symbol of hope, a reminder that miracles still happened, that David could still triumph over Goliath. "You know, Daddy," Emma said softly, "I think Magnus knew all along, knew that he belonged here, knew that everything would work out." Thomas smiled, wrapping one arm around his daughter and the other around his wife. The evening air was sweet with the scent of growing things, of life and renewal. In the distance, the Christmas tree saplings swayed gently in the breeze, promising future harvests and continued blessings. Maybe he did, sweetheart, Thomas replied. Maybe he knew that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in what we have, but in what we believe, and that love, faith, and courage can still move mountains, or in our case, help a small farmer change the world. As if in agreement, Magnus lifted his head, his wise eyes reflecting the golden light of sunset. In that moment, Thomas knew with absolute certainty that some things in life couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. They could only be measured by the depth of one's courage and the strength of one's heart. The Wheeler farm had become more than just a success story. It had become a beacon of hope, a living testament to the power of faith, and a reminder that in a world of constant change, some values remained timeless, and that perhaps was the greatest miracle of all.